Most prisoners spend every waking second dreaming of the moment the gates open. But in February 1946 at Camp Concordia, Kansas, 600 German soldiers staged a strike for the exact opposite reason. As American guards stood by in disbelief, these men refused to eat, refused to move, and most shockingly refused to be liberated. They weren't fighting for their country anymore. They were fighting to stay in the heart of the nation they had just tried to destroy. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, a former Afrika Korps soldier who'd picked sugar beets alongside Kansas farmers for 3 years, stood slowly. His English had become nearly perfect. "We will not eat," he announced, his voice carrying across the hall, "until we receive guarantee we will not be sent back to Germany." Colonel Francis Howard stood in the doorway, a telegram crumpled in his fist. It contained orders from Washington. All German POWs were to be repatriated immediately. He'd expected relief, perhaps celebration. Instead, he faced something the War Department had never anticipated: prisoners who would rather starve than go home. The camps stretched from New York to California, Texas to Idaho. Over 700 facilities holding 425,000 German prisoners of war. It was the largest POW operation in American history. And by early 1946, thousands of these prisoners were about to stage a rebellion that would be erased from history. Not a rebellion against their captors, but against liberation itself. To understand their resistance, you have to understand what captivity in America actually meant. Lieutenant Werner Kritzinger was captured in Tunisia in May 1943. Nazi propaganda had prepared him for torture, starvation, possibly execution. He and his fellow prisoners crossed the Atlantic in cramped shipholds, convinced they sailed toward doom. What he found at Camp Hearn, Texas, shattered every expectation. "I could not believe my eyes," Kritzinger later wrote, in a letter preserved in the National Archives. "The American guards handed us Coca-Cola. We had been fighting for years, eating black bread when we could get it, and they gave us this sweet cold drink like we were guests, not enemies." The daily calorie count for German POWs in American camps was set at 4,000 calories, higher than the ration for American civilians, nearly double what German civilians were receiving in bombed-out cities by 1944. The prisoners were paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip for labor. They had access to libraries, sports equipment, musical instruments. At Camp Como in Mississippi, German POWs published a newspaper called Der Ruf that included book reviews, poetry, philosophical debates. At Camp Mexia in Texas, prisoners built an elaborate miniature German village complete with working fountain. At Camp Trinidad in Colorado, they formed a 50-piece symphony orchestra that performed Beethoven and Mozart for local townspeople. Before we continue, if you're finding this story as fascinating as we did researching it, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these untold chapters of history. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. Gefreiter Otto Werner had lost 40 pounds during the fighting in France. Within 4 months at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, he'd gained it all back. "But I felt guilty eating so much," he recalled years later. "My mother's letters told me she was surviving on turnips and potato peels, and here I was eating roast beef and ice cream." The Geneva Convention permitted POWs to work outside war industries. With American men overseas and labor shortages crippling agriculture, German prisoners were contracted to farms, canneries, and lumber camps. Each morning at Camp Concordia, trucks carried them to nearby fields. These assignments became cultural exchanges. Prisoners ate at farmers' tables, learned English from children, celebrated holidays with families, and sometimes fell in love despite official prohibitions. Martha Muller, a German-American farmwife in Kansas, later described the paradox. "We had 3 German boys working our wheat harvest in 1944. My husband was overseas fighting, and I was feeding German soldiers at my table. They weren't monsters from newsreels. They were homesick boys with photographs of their mothers." Suspicion softened into recognition. By mid-1945, more than 200,000 German POWs labored beyond camp fences. They harvested cotton in Texas, picked fruit in California, cut timber in Minnesota, and processed sugar beets in Colorado. They earned small wages and wrote letters home, describing abundance and imagining futures, not tied to ruined cities. On June 15, 1945, Hauptmann Erich Seybold learned the war in Europe had ended. Instead of joy, he felt dread. His city, Dresden, was destroyed. His parents were dead. As 1945 closed, thousands shared his fear. In January 1946, the War Department ordered rapid repatriation under Geneva rules. The numbers were stark. Much of Berlin lay in rubble. Hamburg had lost half its housing. Cologne's population had collapsed. Daily rations in the British zone hovered near starvation levels, and conditions were worse in the Soviet zone. Germany was divided into occupations, and prisoners feared where they might be sent. On January 18, 1946, at Camp Concordia, prisoners drafted a petition to President Truman requesting permission to remain in America. They pledged honest work and loyalty to democracy. Germany, they wrote, offered only ruin and hunger. 347 men signed, preferring imprisonment to return. Similar petitions appeared at camps across the country. Camp Hearn, 412 prisoners. Camp Trinidad, 289. Camp Clark, over 500. The answer from Washington was unequivocal: no. The Geneva Convention required repatriation. There would be no exceptions. That's when the resistance began. The first hunger strike started at Camp Concordia on February 12th. Within a week, similar strikes had spread to camps in Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado. Colonel Howard was baffled. He'd dealt with occasional disciplinary problems before, fights between Nazi hardliners and anti-Nazi prisoners, minor work refusals, escape attempts. But this was different. This was organized, nonviolent, and emotionally complex. "How do I discipline men for not wanting to leave prison?" he wrote in a report dated February 18th. "These are not violent men. They're not destroying property. They're simply refusing to cooperate with their own liberation." At Camp Dermott in Arkansas, prisoners staged coordinated work slowdowns. Local farmers who'd contracted for their labor complained. "These boys have worked hard for us for 2 years, one farmer wrote to his congressman. "Now, you're sending them back to starvation. Where's the humanity in that?" At Camp Como in Mississippi, prisoners hired a local lawyer using their accumulated work wages. The lawyer, Robert Hutchinson, actually took the case seriously. His February 1946 brief argued that German POWs who'd performed essential civilian labor should be eligible for special immigration status. The State Department's response was swift. Granting such requests would violate international law, undermine the Geneva Convention, create impossible precedent. But the prisoners' resistance grew more creative and desperate. At Camp Hearn, Unteroffizier Josef Kramer had fallen in love with a German-American woman named Anna Schneider. Her family owned a dairy farm where he'd worked for 18 months. Fraternization was forbidden, but in the relative freedom of work assignments, relationships had formed. Kramer proposed marriage, hoping it might provide legal grounds to stay. Anna Schneider applied for permission to marry Kramer. The Army denied it. Immigration authorities made clear that even if they married, Kramer would still be deported. Anna would have to choose between her country and her husband. On March 15, 1946, Kramer attempted suicide by cutting his wrists. He survived, but the incident sent shockwaves through the camp system. At Camp Clinton in Mississippi, prisoners stopped singing German songs in the evenings. Instead, they sang American songs they'd learned. "Home on the Range," "You Are My Sunshine," even "The Star-Spangled Banner." It was a quiet, mournful protest, a way of declaring who they felt they'd become. Private First Class James Morrison, a guard at Camp Trinidad, wrote home on March 22nd. "We're packing up boys who've worked beside us, eaten with us, played baseball with us. Some are crying, others just look dead inside. I joined up to fight Germans, and I did. But these don't feel like the enemy anymore." Behind the statistics were individual stories of heartbreaking complexity. Werner Lentz had been captured at Salerno in September 1943. He spent nearly 3 years at Camp Swift in Texas working as a carpenter. When he learned his hometown of Dresden had been destroyed in the February 1945 firebombing, he received confirmation his entire family was dead. Parents, sister, fiancé. What was he returning to? Lenz wrote to the camp chaplain, Father William O'Connor. The letter, dated April 3, 1946, reads, "Father, I believe in God's plan, but I cannot understand it. I survived the war only to be sent back to a graveyard. Everyone I loved is dead. The city I knew is ash. Here in Texas I have friends, I have purpose. The family I work for treats me like a son. Why must I leave life to return to death?" Father O'Connor tried to intervene. He was told politely but firmly that exceptions were impossible. At Camp Clark in Missouri, a prisoner named Carl Becker had become close to a local farming family named Wilson. The Wilson's son had been killed at Normandy. Initially, they'd been hostile to German prisoners, but over time, working alongside Becker, they found something unexpected. Not forgiveness exactly, but a more complex understanding. When Becker was scheduled for deportation, Mr. Wilson drove to the camp. "I know this is unusual," he said. "My boy died fighting Germans, but Carl isn't who killed him. Can't we see the difference? Carl wants to stay. We want him to stay. He could work our farm. Why isn't that possible?" The commander had no answer that satisfied anyone. Despite protests, petitions, and pleas, repatriation proceeded on schedule. Prisoners were loaded onto trains, transported to ports, placed on Liberty ships bound for Europe. At Camp Concordia, the hunger strike ended, not because prisoners changed their minds, but because authorities threatened force-feeding and solitary confinement before deportation. Faced with spending their final days in America in isolation, most chose to eat and spend remaining time with friends. The final transports left American camps between April and July 1946. At Camp Hearn, local townspeople came to the fence to say goodbye. Some brought gifts, food for the journey, addresses where letters could be sent, photographs. German prisoners lined up for roll call one last time, collected their few possessions, marched to waiting trucks under armed guard. Many wept openly. On May 23rd, the last group left Camp Concordia. Hans Schmidt, who'd announced the hunger strike 4 months earlier, was among them. As the truck pulled away, he looked back at the Kansas prairie, at the country that had been his home longer than anywhere since the war began. An American guard later recalled, "They looked like men going to execution, not men going home." The fate of repatriated prisoners varied dramatically. Those sent to American, British, or French zones faced severe hardship but generally survived. They returned to cities of rubble, an economy in collapse, a population traumatized and divided. Finding housing was nearly impossible. Food remained scarce until the Marshall Plan began delivering aid in 1948. For those whose homes were now in the Soviet zone, the situation was far worse. Many were immediately rearrested and sent to labor camps. Others disappeared into a police state, where their time in America made them suspect. A few prisoners did eventually make it back to America, though it took years. Werner Lentz, the carpenter from Dresden, immigrated in 1952 under the Displaced Persons Act. He settled in Texas, not far from Camp Swift, where he'd been imprisoned. He worked as a carpenter until his death in 1989. Helmut Friedrich, a teacher who'd taught English classes to fellow prisoners at Camp Mexia, also eventually immigrated. Arriving in 1954, he taught German at a Missouri high school and wrote a memoir in 1976 titled Prisoner of Peace. Carl Becker managed to return in 1953, sponsored by the Wilson family. He worked their farm for 20 years, never married, was buried in the Wilson family plot when he died in 1973. But these were exceptions. Most never returned. They rebuilt lives in Germany, carried memories of America like ghosts, rarely spoke about their time as prisoners who'd fought to stay imprisoned. Joseph Kramer, who'd attempted suicide rather than leave Anna Schneider, survived and was deported. Anna waited 3 years, then traveled to Germany to find him in 1949. They married in Munich. She stayed with him, giving up her American citizenship. The reverse of what they'd hoped. Why has this story been so thoroughly forgotten? partly because it complicated narratives both sides wanted to tell. For America, the story of German POWs who loved captivity raised uncomfortable questions. Why did prisoners live better than many American civilians, especially Black Americans, still subject to Jim Crow laws? Several camps where Germans were held had better facilities than African American neighborhoods nearby, a fact that didn't escape notice. For Germany, the story was even more uncomfortable. It suggested some German soldiers had preferred America to the fatherland, which challenged post-war narratives of universal German suffering and victimhood. But perhaps most significantly, it was forgotten because it humanized the enemy in ways that didn't fit clean categories. These weren't concentration camp guards or SS fanatics. They were ordinary soldiers who discovered in captivity that the enemy they'd been taught to hate was more humane than the regime they'd served. Military files on POW resistance to repatriation were classified for decades. When finally opened, they revealed the scale. At least 15,000 German POWs across more than 30 camps had participated in some form of resistance. Hunger strikes, petitions, work stoppages, legal appeals, none of it changed the outcome. By August 1946, fewer than 5,000 German POWs remained in the United States, mostly those deemed too sick to travel or facing war crimes investigations. By 1947, the camps were empty. The last documented letter protesting repatriation is dated June 30, 1946, from Camp Shanks in New York. The prisoner's name was Heinrich Miller. He wrote to the camp commander, "I do not ask to avoid punishment for my country's crimes. I ask only to be allowed to stay and build something better than what we destroyed. Is that not justice too?" No response is recorded in his file. He was shipped to Germany on July 5th. The story reveals something profound about ideology, identity, and human connection. These men had been raised in a totalitarian state, indoctrinated with propaganda about racial superiority and the degeneracy of democracy. They'd fought for Hitler's vision of Europe. Yet, when confronted with the reality of American life not perfect, not without its own deep injustices, but fundamentally different from what they'd been told, many changed. They changed not through punishment or re-education programs, but through ordinary human contact, through eating at farmhouse tables, through working alongside people they'd been taught to despise, through discovering the enemy wasn't monstrous, just human. When given the choice between returning to a familiar ideology in ruins or embracing a new future in a foreign land, thousands chose the latter. They chose it knowing they might never see their families again, knowing they'd be marked as traitors by some. They chose it through the desperate logic of people who'd seen both sides and understood the difference. The rebellion failed, of course. The Geneva Convention was clear. International law demanded repatriation. The United States couldn't simply absorb hundreds of thousands of former enemy soldiers, no matter how reformed they appeared. But the fact that it happened at all tells us something essential, that German soldiers would hunger strike to stay in prison camps, that American farmers would plead for prisoners to remain, that the lines between captive and captor could blur so completely. It reveals the human capacity for change and connection, even in history's darkest chapter. In February 1946, in a Kansas mess hall, 600 men refused to eat because they wanted to stay in prison. By the logic of war, it made no sense. By the logic of human transformation, it made perfect sense. They'd come to America as enemies and found something unexpected, a future. Being forced to give it up felt not like liberation, but like a second capture. This time by fate, by law, by the implacable demands of history. So they resisted, knowing it was futile. Because the alternative was accepting that what they'd discovered about America, about themselves, about the possibility of becoming something different, meant nothing in the face of international treaties and political necessity. They lost their rebellion. But the fact they fought it remains a hidden chapter that deserves remembering. The camps are gone now, most erased completely, returned to farmland, converted to other uses, abandoned to decay. But in the archives, the letters remain, the petitions, the reports of hunger strikes and desperate pleas. And somewhere in those documents is a truth neither side wanted to acknowledge, that even in war, people are capable of becoming more than their circumstances suggest. Sometimes even prisoners can be transformed. Sometimes even enemies can become neighbors. And sometimes the hardest prison to escape is the one waiting at home.